like I should jump into one of my best man speeches at a wedding with you all like this, actually. So thank you. My name is Maiden, and I'm basically a techie guy. I have a background in computer science, PhD in computer science, worked with computers, and then became interested in creativity. So I stand before you without any professional know-how as a researcher or a practitioner in social care. Now, having said that, we have been partners in research projects looking at how we can bring digital creativity into residential care for older people. So some of the examples I will use draw on that experience, but if you find them simplistic or inappropriate, apologies, that's just where I'm coming from. So we had Vlad's talk this morning. I had no idea what he was going to say, and I had no idea what he was going to say, and vice versa, sorry. But I think there's complementarity. So what I'm going to do, if I get this to big, is talk about four things. Talk about AI and a variation on what Vlad talked about this morning, everyday creativity and everyday creative thinking. I think it's a concept and a practice that is severely undervalued, and I think it's something that we should all embrace and seek techniques to do. I'll then give you four very practical examples of creative thinking techniques, and these are not the only four. They are a set of probably 30 or 40 that are kind of commonly out there with different names, and we've used them extensively in different kinds of practices. And I'll probably put more flesh on the bone than Vlad had with his little boxes this morning. And then what I'll do is say, well, actually, you don't have to stop there, because you've probably noticed that AI has become a thing. So for much of my career, I was an academic interested in AI and creativity. And at any dinner party, they would go, you what? And then suddenly, November 22, ChatGPT, GPT-3 appears. Suddenly everyone goes, oh yeah. Now our approach isn't quite like that, but I don't think we could ignore the major impact on professional work across sectors of AI. And the AI you're using now, if you use it at all, will be the worst you'll ever use. GPT released a new visualization drawing version last week that can put all kinds of cartoonists and filmmakers potentially out of business. So don't underestimate the value, but I don't want you to be here thinking that this is about automation of your jobs. We are very much in the position of AI to augment rather than automate. It just becomes another tool that you can add to your toolkit. So I'll talk about that, give you four examples of AI tools that you can use, some that we made, and I'll go eventually finish with ChatGPT. And then, because Vlad made a pitch for his own work in Dublin this morning, I will make a pitch for our work in London, in case you don't want the water to get away. And Charlotte, of course I'm an academic, she said, well, you're not going to be too theoretical, are you? So I'm going to try and be practical. This is not a tutorial. The point of a keynote is to present ideas from different disciplines, different angles, but I'll try and make it as practical as I can. So let's talk about AI. How many people have used ChatGPT? I'm just curious. Okay. Well, that was interesting. Social experiment of the day. Okay. You've got an idea of what it does. I would say about a third of the hands sort of went up and then all right. So what is AI? I'm not going to stand here and give you technical definitions. Essentially, it's one of many forms of technology. So what you use with ChatGPT, this what's called generative AI, is only one form of AI. AI has been around since the 60s, and there are many different versions of it. And essentially, the best way to think about it, it is a technology that's capable of automating things that we as intelligent human beings have done in the past. It's nothing more than that. It's simply a digital machine to automate some of our thinking and coordination processes. So it's what we were able to do in the past. And pretty much until 4 or 5 years ago, it was quite task-specific. So even in the 80s, when I was a student, you would have technologies that were called expert systems that could diagnose, take the symptoms of a patient and diagnose what the underlying causes might be, or detect faults. And businesses like NASA still have these kinds of systems running to detect faults in spacecraft and so on, and their manufacture. And then more recently you get into what is called machine learning, and it's all around detecting tumors and stuff, but it's primarily task specific. Now what's happened over the last 2 and a bit years is suddenly you start to move to what is called this idea of general intelligence. Now let me be clear, OpenAI and all these guys are not going to build some sort of general intelligence sci-fi like. We're a long, long, long way from that, regardless of what they say. But essentially these tools, which are called large language models, are able to produce any kind of text and increasingly image and video output in response to the question that you ask or the request that you put in. It's called a prompt. And that is different. We haven't had that capability before. And it can answer questions around social care. In fact, some of the examples I'm going to put in, I asked GPT. Why not? I'm not a social care expert. It gives me stimulation and ideas. So it gives me that other perspective that Vlad was talking about this morning that I might not have thought of. Now, what I think is fascinating is that almost all of the talk about the use of this form of generative AI is really around productivity and efficiency. We can make our economies more productive this way. You listened to the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer a few weeks ago. He said, we can give our teachers their Sunday evenings back, which is the most damning example I could think of, really. Maybe we didn't overwork them so much. But it's really not about, there's only a limited benefit in productivity. The IMF reckons if we manage to sort of get this kind of AI out there, we might make a 1.5% productivity gain over 20 years. So there's not a huge benefit there. I think we need to look for future uses which are more value added. And I think one of those is around creativity and innovation, which isn't where a lot of this work is at the moment. So, Vlad already basically gave this definition this morning, I didn't know that. But for me, creative thinking is really about producing work that's novel and useful. It's as simple as that. It rules out the wacky. If I was to stand on my head for the next 30 seconds to try and do this keynote, that's probably novel, you've never seen that before, but I'd pass out and fall off the stage after about 5, so it wouldn't be useful. So you've got these sort of tensions there between creativity and useful. And what I think is, we've got to take this word creativity away from the creative industries. Because if you accept that definition, most forms of everyday problem solving require you to come up with something that's slightly different. Unless it's completely routine, creative problem solving, or problem solving itself, is creative in an everyday sense. So essentially, if you're problem solving, you need to be creative. And that's got nothing to do with arts and aesthetics and so on. It's just about learning different techniques to solve problems. Often when I'm talking to sectors like finance, banking, various industries, creativity is actually, it's like the other C word that you're not allowed to mention. You know, you can mention innovation, but we're not creative. This is rubbish. They're fundamentally misunderstanding what creativity is. It's not about the arts, it's about problem solving in general. And obviously, you've got this notion of novelty. Novelty is key to determining what's a creative outcome. Well, novelty is relative. Something that I might say to these people at the front, they hear it and they go, oh, that's new to me. But it might not be to new to people at the back. But that doesn't stop it still being new to you. So novelty is very relative. And that relativity gives us the ability to distinguish between different kinds of outcomes. So most of you, as social care professionals, ultimately are trying to generate perhaps outcomes that are novel and useful to enable you to earn a living or to support people in their lives, to live better quality lives. And that's fine. And that was what you generally call those outcomes, those final outcomes, the delivery of the service, are what I generally call pro-C creativity. But these outcomes don't just land like Mr. Bean at the start of an episode, fully formed. It doesn't happen that way. Anyone who's been involved in brainstorming sessions will know that there's kind of lots of very small episodes of creative thinking and imagination that slowly emerge. And quite often, if you try to go back at the end of a day's workshop and figure out where the big idea came from, most people can't work it out. The traceability is hard to discern. And that's because really what's happening in any kind of creative thinking process is a multitude of little c creative outcomes. These very small, everyday creative thinking steps as we perhaps reframe the problem, remove a constraint, come up with an idea, pivot, another idea, Before you know it, you've got something that is actually valuable and new and you could apply in your work. But it's really the aggregation of this little c creativity that's key. So what we need is the knowledge and the skill set about how to be regularly creative every day. Finally, if you're doubting why creativity might not be important, the World Economic Forum every year surveys tens of thousands of employers about what they want from their employees in terms of skills. And up until recently, the top three have been critical thinking, problem solving, and creativity. Now, I reckon creativity and problem solving are the same thing, in my view. So actually, two of the top three skills that most employers want are creative thinking. We moved out of this sort of post-industrial manufacturing process into the need for everyday creative thinking in the in the workforce, and that's recognized globally now. So that's my sort of opening pitch to you, and I'll try and map this across to social care work. So if you think about creative examples that you might apply in social care, and this is one of the cases where I at least took some stimulation from ChatGPT, it's in personalising the activity plans of an older person that's in your care, just changing the order or the sequences or the timings of events. It's novel, but if it's useful, then it's creative. Using different kinds of storytelling techniques to communicate, maybe using different forms of sign language or other kinds of physical communication rather than the traditional verbal routes. Recognizing that the meals don't have to be taught at the same time and having taught different patterns that you could use to flex those meal times. That might be novel to the person in your care, and therefore it's novel and creative and valuable to them. Low-cost social inclusion activities such as pen pals with schools. Setting up different kinds of music playlists for handling different kinds of agitated moods, etc., etc. I mean, you simply go into ChatGPT, and as long as you don't give away your client's details, you can get all this stuff there quite quickly. So I would argue that there's considerable scope for this everyday creative thinking and problem solving in social care. And as Vlad asked this morning, we have to ask ourselves why it's not happening everywhere, every day. So Vlad gave one perspective. Mine is slightly different, but it's still grounded in a theory or model of creative thinking. And it comes from one of our great thinkers around creativity for the last 30 or 40 years, Teresa Amabile. And she came up with a very simple model. This is the overly simplified version to get it in one slide. But she says, essentially, for people to be regular creative thinkers and effective problem solvers, they need three things. They need to have intrinsic task motivation. They just want to do it. I think most people in this room are intrinsically motivated by what they do, probably also extrinsically. But if you have that motivation, you've got one of the three things you need to be creative. You need to have some knowledge and expertise in the domain. You need to know about the problems, the challenges, the theories, the regulation, and the possible solutions. Again, many people in this room, I mean most, have that. What we lack are the creative thinking and problem-solving skills. Vlad alluded to this morning. Our education systems knock the creativity out of us. There have been studies within the UK education system that shows that children at the age of 5 are more creative than they are at the age of 11, and by the time they got to 16, their creative skills and capabilities are reduced even further. And we see that in the university system. We've had to introduce creative thinking courses to undergraduates and postgraduates to fill the gap. So we are all actually, I think, to a degree, victims of our education systems that has not valued creative thinking and has not provided us with a suitable set of skills. And in fact, I think it's almost about giving ourselves permission to be creative. I've ran so many workshops for corporations over the years, and I'll have people come along and say, oh, excuse me, I've been sent, I'm not very creative, I'm going to sit at the back, read the newspaper for a couple of days, I hope you don't mind. You just go, oh, whatever, as long as I've been paid. And by the end, when they realise that creativity is something else to what they thought it was, they're at the front, they're engaged. So it's about giving ourselves the permission to engage in this everyday creative thinking, because it's just problem solving. We're just framing it slightly differently to bring in all of these different aspects and approaches. So I think if we've got some set of creative thinking skills to bring to the table, we can solve problems better every day. And of course, it will also help us to use the AI that's becoming available, because if you go to a large language model, you go to ChatGPT, it's not intelligent, it's not creative. In fact, I'll come on to your reasons later why it's actually uncreative. But you can use it to be creative, but you just need a little bit of creativity knowledge to do that. So, for those of you who haven't ever used AI, that on the left is a little bit of what ChatGPT 4.0 looks like, okay? So basically, I go into a browser, I type in that question at the top, and it comes back with that. And of course, I could then engage with the discussion in it. It's very simple, it's a bit like a chatbot, really, but it's got this huge model behind it that's sort of working out the probabilistic likelihood of the most appropriate sentence to put in front of me in response to my question. Now, for the last 2.5 years, we've almost been over-bombarded in studies looking at how this affects different aspects of work, productivity, efficiency, and indeed creativity. And so there are multiple studies looking at how putting one of these tools in front of somebody doing professional work makes a difference. Creative writing, consulting, management consulting work, architects, etc., etc., etc. I'm not aware of it in social care. It may have happened, I just haven't seen it due to the breadth of this work. And overall, what we tend to find is that someone trying to solve a problem without the tool, and someone trying to solve a problem with the tool, you get a slight boost in the novelty of the ideas and the volume of the ideas that are generated when they use the tool. So as an individual, it helps you. It gives you other ideas, those other perspectives that Vlad was talking about this morning. However, if we were all to use GPT to try and come up with ideas, all the people in this room, we tend to get pushed towards the middle. As one of my students calls it, a homogeneous grey mass. And that's simply because how the tools work. The AI is trying to spot the common patterns. So if we all use it, we'll all generally come up with the same set of ideas. So if you actually use GPT in the large, and for large group efforts, you tend to get pushed towards reduced novelty across us all, and that's not particularly great. And what I also find is that most people don't use GPT in creative ways, and it's because they haven't got that knowledge of creativity. They don't understand how to be creative. They don't know about all the creative techniques that have been published. So what I'm going to do in the next section is simply talk about 4 creative thinking techniques that Vlad kind of actually touched upon, but not quite in this way. I'm going to be more concrete than probably he was. And if you're wondering where this comes from, there is a vast literature out there in creative problem-solving techniques. The history of them really goes back to the US marketing sector in the 1950s, the kind of Mad Men world in that TV series that was on Netflix a few years ago. And that in turn drew on the experiences of the US military towards the end of the Second World War, where they needed to come up with more creative problem-solving ways to cross bridges and not have the top-down command structure as they tried to end the war as quickly as possible. So there's this, 75, 80 years of experience of these techniques, and generally we know they work. And if we know they work in other sectors, why the hell don't we use them in others? So my argument is, rather than go and do a degree in creativity, go and get one of those airport management books that's got these techniques in them, like Alco's Thinker Toys, etc., and just sort of practice them and see how they work for you. Now, I'm not going to read the book out to you here, but I'm going to go through 4. The first one's called constraint removal. Then I'm going to talk about something called triggers, Hall of Fame, and analogical reasoning. They're all quite simple, and hopefully you can take each of them away and play. Constraint removal. Basically, our assumptions about the world are mental blocks on our creative thinking. They're things that we assume to be true, that whatever we try, as individuals, we struggle to get rid of them. About 15 years ago, my wife and I were redesigning our kitchen at home. Quite honestly, she's also an intelligent, educated person. We decided to put in underfloor heating, which meant that we then were moving the radiators around, but we wanted to keep a radiator to put the towels on when you do the washing up, just to dry them. We couldn't find the wall space for it. Could not work out where to put it. Weeks of this discussion went on, and eventually the professional kitchen designer who we'd hired came in, and he just looked at me and said, "Neil, all you have to do is hang the door the other way around." I There's this awkward silence between me and my wife, because I'm supposed to be creative. She basically said, what the heck, you're supposed to be smart at this. But I think it's a perfectly good example of how assumptions block our creative thinking. I wasn't able to think about it. I've actually posited taking the door off, and apparently that's illegal in UK housing regulations. But I never thought about putting it on the other side. It was a mental block that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't look past. And that is a common constraint on our creative thinking. And you often find this technique being used in a lot of design work. To give you a slightly more real-world example, I thought this one was quite relevant, it's just up the road, it was Belfast City Airport. So we went into Belfast City Airport, it was about 15 years ago, and we were running an entire process about how to make the airport run more efficiently, improving its flight operations and services and so on. And we ran a session, an afternoon, on constraint removal. And what we asked them to do was to tell us all the constraints that were stopping the airport be efficient. And one of the ones that came up was the endless variability of the weather in Northern Ireland. And that led to lots of jokes about sort of 4 seasons in an afternoon and all this kind of thing. So we said, all right then, from now on, for the next 20 minutes, the weather is absolutely stable. It's like the Caribbean in whenever, you know, where they're outside of 20, and they're all laughing, but you encourage them to work this through. And after a while, they came up with steam catapults for takeoffs. You know, reduce the noise and other kinds of pollution because they would know that the thing would fly. You're all looking a bit nervous now. They came up with glided approaches, turning off the engines 500 metres over as you're coming over the lock, because the wind was utterly predictable. You knew where the plane would land because they are designed to glide if the engines go off for a certain distance. We talked about weather-adapted approach routes, being able to adapt where the plane was coming because we knew the weather was going to be to remove bombs and so on. And actually what we ended up with, a really sort of serious idea, was highly accurate prediction systems about the weather for noise pollution. Because one of the problems was, depending on which way the wind was blowing, one part of the population of Belfast got arsy about the noise and would start complaining. And they just couldn't think past the fact of how they could sort of deal with this. The basic idea is that people become less complaining if they know it's going to happen in advance. It's the surprise of it. So they actually then said, well, all we need is a highly accurate and up-to-date weather prediction system, and it will overcome this problem. And that was part of the design that went forward. Now, you should argue, these are people running Belfast City Airport and working for major airlines. They should have seen that. But again, it's like the door hinges. It's like a mental block that they couldn't work past. Using constraint removal is a deliberate technique to remove constraints and then explore the possibilities that become possible when you remove them, even if in the end we had to admit that weather variability was something we can control, is a way forward. This quote here, if you can see it at the bottom, is from Dennis Lasdon. He was an architect who designed the Festival Hall on the London South Bank. And his approach to design was, don't give them what they wanted, but give them what they never dreamed they wanted. And in some senses, constraint removal sort of encapsulates that. You're trying to remove all the constraints and enable them to capture their dreams. So how do we do constraint removal? You might want to So don't be constrained by their immobility. Imagine that they can be mobile and then work out what is possible without that constraint and then figure out what you could do. So, yeah, you could still do aqua aerobics with supported walking and core support and so on like this. You would be able to encourage them to still take part in active volunteering if they served at reception desks at libraries and so on. So there are ways around this. So constraint removal is my first technique. Second one is called creativity thinking, or triggers, we just call them in the end. And there's something that many people don't really appreciate about creativity, which is that at a particular level of abstraction, it repeats. There are kind of creative patterns that appear again and again and again. There's a guy called Altshuller, and he worked in the Soviet patent office in the 60s and 70s. So his job was to look at patent applications coming across his desk and basically push them into yes or no. And doing that for about a decade, he realized that there were kind of common patterns. The ones that made it to the yes adhered to certain qualities. And basically, once the Soviet Empire collapsed, he turned this into a methodology that has found its way into Western consulting. And there's basically 40 patterns in this kind of pre-digital world. We repeated this, our own research for digital tools, and came up with our own patterns. So if you know what you're looking for, if you know what is likely to be creative based on these patterns, you can actually design your thinking to go and find ideas, find the possibilities that adhere to those patterns. So to give you an example of some that we build, one of those triggers or patterns is that innovative solutions tend to be more convenient. We as customers have to do less if the service does more. It's kind of obvious when you say it, but you have to write it down. And therefore we can offer these kind of guidelines to designers to find ideas. When I first saw these, I thought they were overly trivial, but God, do they work. You give them to people in workshops. Similarly, another pattern is people are trying to live more economically in these austere times. Conspicuous wealth tends to be unfashionable. Can you make your service run cheaper? Can you make it more efficient and less glowy? And people use these simple triggers to come up with ideas. So the interesting challenge for you is what's out there in social care. I just took some sort of obvious sort of goals that you might associate with quality of life. I've highlighted one here, social life maintained. Can you build a set of triggers? Or could we build a set of triggers with you to get you think about sort of the things you might do to encourage social life? So these triggers are there as kind of slide decks or card decks that can be used to stimulate creative thinking, or even become digital, obviously. Third example is a technique called Hall of Fame, or as we used to call it, what would Rupert Murdoch do? I guess it's a bit out of date now, it really should be what Elon would do. You're trying to find a nasty, provocative persona in order to break your chain of thought. Personas are normally examples, prototypical examples of what you will be your customers or your service consumers. However, if you use popular, well-known personas and imagine what they would do in your place, just again as a thought exercise to break the chains of thought, then it actually can be surprisingly effective as a technique. So again, we were working with, God, that doesn't come out very well, we were working with the BBC, and you can kind of, if you know your BBC programs, you can kind of figure out the area we're in here. And we ran a workshop again where we used this Hall of Fame technique with these kind of BBC personas to develop some systems to work within the BBC, and it was extremely effective. So, in social care, are there personas, well-known people that you could use and build up a deck of 15, 20 of these? So, this is to Greta Thunberg and Jane Goodall and people. Could you build up a set of these personas that become available to you as a team or as individuals that you can go to and go, how would Jane Goodall solve this problem? How would Greta Thunberg solve this problem? Where it was Greta, she might sort of push the greater intergenerational justice. Is there some idea that comes from that? Could she be about empowering the youth voices through more activism? Is that does that break your chains of thought, remove the assumptions and get you to think differently? Could she kind of link social and environmental campaigns and justice in different ways, again, to get you to think differently? Now this technique, just to stress, this is not ours, this is a technique, a Hall of Fame that's been around for decades, and is used commercially again and again and again with success. Fourth technique is analogical thinking. It's about saying, there's a problem that's already been solved somewhere. Let's find a similar problem that's already been solved and bring in some ideas from it into your problem. So you're the blue side, if you see what I mean, when you're doing social care. So yes, normally something's been solved before, you kind of map it across and you come up with ideas for your domain. And the key idea here is that even though you're engaged in creative thinking, there's only a finite number of problems out there. Someone's already solved them somewhere before, you just got to find where. Again, technical digital tools can help us with this. So an example of this we used to run in lots of our training exercises was a day-long workshop in which people had to design their personal aircraft. It was like a flying car. It's highly speculative. And so we would take them through a whole raft of exercises, and the one that is relevant here is the analogical reasoning. We brought in a bicycle courier. Now let's be clear, this wasn't a real bicycle courier, it was a staged bicycle courier who'd learned the script. And he or she would come in and we would ask them what sorts of tricks that they would use with their bicycle to get around the city wherever we were, Shanghai, London, Paris, wherever we were doing this. And she would talk about, or he would talk about, well, we would swarm together for safety at traffic lights. We would hold on to the back of buses to get speed. We could take the wheels off our bikes really quickly if we had to leave them at the bottom of a block of flats and so on. Then we go to the guys, okay, that's what the bicycle courier does. What ideas can you borrow from that in order to design your aircraft? And you could start to see aircrafts coming together for security in the sky. This is probably relevant now with drones and so on. Coupling together in trains to become more efficient, etc., etc. So analogical reasoning, if you understand the basics of looking for a problem that's already been solved, that's similar to yours, can give you a lot of leeway. Oops, done that already, too many animations. So, if you're responsible for managing the distressing behavior of an older person in your care, could you look at different aspects of teenage parenting? I'm not saying they're the same, right? I'm not making an equivalence. But are there some issues around sort of perhaps boundary setting that could be used as a source of inspiration to bring across? Look at good practices in teenage parenting, map them across, and then decide what ideas might arise. Again, you're breaking those normal chains of thought. Even how police manage and try and de-escalate situations. Again, I'm not making any equivalence here. It's not about judgments and so on, but there might be some ideas in the practices that they use that could be brought across in order to map and give you ideas, give you breaking that chain of thought. So I've just ran through 4 of these techniques. As I said, in my experience, there's about 30 or 40 of these creative thinking techniques that are out there. We built a tool that describes them all, and even with little videos. So if you do want to follow these up, the website's at the top there, becreative.city.ac.uk, and then you can explore them either by saying, well, I want something to do problem definition or ideation, or you can just type in keywords, and you get an idea of what those techniques do. I think you may be surprised at how simple they are. Vlad talked about the one where you simply rewrite your challenge with different words. It's surprisingly effective. It's up there as one of those 30. So if you want to follow that, take a look and reach out. So far I haven't really talked that much about AI. But of course, AI is transformative. It is genuinely now the 4th industrial revolution. It's kind of scary. There's a lot of negative sides that you see around society, fragmentation, politics, right-wing, etc. But it's also enormously empowering if we learn to use it. So what I'm going to do here is just talk about 4 tools, 3 that we built, and then talk a little bit about ChatGPT. And what we've done with these tools is we've taken all that knowledge about the techniques that I just talked about and digitized it. So rather than have me there as a facilitator helping you to use Hall of Fame or the triggers, the tool does all the hard work for you. It's not automating, but it's supporting you in your creative thinking using tried and tested techniques. So let's jump into BrightSparks. So BrightSparks, you can see at the URL that's at the bottom. It's not really AI at all. We built it about 10 years ago, and it just stayed there. It's basically a digital version of that Hall of Fame. What would Rupert Murdoch or Elon Musk do? I got a bit sick after a while trying to come up with these sort of pictures of personas for different organizations to use. So we built a tool with hundreds of them in, And you can see the tool here. So it's all digitally curated famous personas. You can group them by designers, superheroes, etc. And on the right, you can just about see that the tool just doesn't give you the persona, it also gives you clues. It's basically you asking you creative questions about that persona. And at any point, you can just ask for a new persona or a new spark by clicking the green button. So to use them, it's incredibly trivial. Even to generate ideas that you just send to yourself via email. So just to give you a shout how it works. We've got Wonder Woman. Maybe I'm not interested in Wonder Woman. Well, there's another one, Paul Smith, British designer. Does he become a sort of interesting source? That doesn't work for me either. Then we get Hercule Poirot, famous Belgian detective. You might go, okay, let's work with Poirot. Let's imagine he is part of the care team. How would he go about trying to solve this problem? You can look at the clues on the other side, giving you advice. You can press the next spark and get another one if you're not liking what's there. And then suddenly, those clues or the ideas, your discussion around them might give you ideas. You just click the ideas box and you start typing in there, and that will get sent to you via email. So you don't even need a user account. It's very, very simple to use. And we've used it extensively both in our teaching and in our client projects. So it's up there. It hasn't got social care personas. We're open to the idea, if people want to collaborate with us to create those kind of social care personas, such as Greta Thunberg, why not? Actually, it's not a lot of effort for us to put another 20 or 30 in there under another category, so we're open to that collaboration. Next, this is something that we call Carer. Now, those of you who are iPhone users will notice that that is an old iPhone. It's an iPhone 3. It normally gets a laugh, but not in this audience, okay. Essentially, we built it, or co-built it, with residential care home groups to help them manage this distressing behaviour, to support their care staff to be more creative. So, essentially, the user's able to type in the particular challenge that they're experiencing, and then the tool has got kind of AI within it that will enable you to sort of generate creative sparks and explore different kinds of cases. So we loaded the tool with different kinds of dementia care cases from other sectors, and including sectors such as policing, as I talked about earlier. So the tool is loaded up with all of these. And so to get an idea how it works, you type in that question, the tool comes back, well, there are these matched previous enhancement plans that you might want to work with. You can pick one of these. And then you can sort of see what happens inside and see whether it gives you a new idea. You notice the red button at the same time. You remove that barrier for typing. Typing is bad for creativity. It's hard to type and be creative at the same time. That's why post-its are still very popular. So we just audio recorded. You just spoke the idea in. It was much more fluid and natural and supportive of creative processes. And you even had less, you get these sparks, and then even less constrained domain. So it would suggest, well, this is what police tend to do with drunken offenders. Could this inspire you? Again, not suggesting there's a direct equivalence. So we evaluated this in residential care homes. We acquired qualitative evidence that it led to it was sort of more effective for sharing knowledge about good care work. It definitely increased their problem-solving skills. But the one thing that really came away from this, and this was about 10, 12 years ago, was it increased the perceived social status of the carers. We trusted them with iPod touches, as they were at the time, and we gave them training, and we trained them up on how to be creative. They actually really felt valued in a way that I hadn't expected. It wasn't an outcome that we judged. So giving people these skills and the tools is also creating a social status that equivalent to professionals in other sectors. So that was something that's worth thinking about. Now, unfortunately, Carer doesn't work anymore. We haven't been able to keep it alive, but we are interested in the ideas, the technologies underlying it are still there. The next one, Life Planner, it's a bit more recent, still there, we're just in the process of redeveloping it. Essentially, we built a computational model of quality of life. Right? We looked at what quality of life is and how it's described, and then we built a computerized model of it. So all the goals that are in the different frameworks for good quality of life, we mapped them out. Then we mapped them out to about 1,000 tasks that people tend to do every day. We ended up with a huge matrix of about 30,000 connections, etc., and then linked it to a tablet app. So that's kind of what part of the model looks like if you draw it visually. And then we built an app that people could use to plan their lives so as to increase their quality of life. We weren't enormously proud of the UI for this, so people could sort of indicate where they wanted to put their preferences. So for example, you're more interested in physical, or I can't read it that close up here, or other kinds of activities. And then based on those rankings, the tool would give you lots of recommendations about how well you were doing to achieve different goals each week. And based on your achievement, it would make recommendations about other kinds of activities that the model says help you to do this. If you want more physical exercise, then consider these. And the tool would link you to different activities in your neighborhood. And this is all pre-Gen AI, and so we think this has got a huge amount of potential. We've got this underlying model, which you can modify and control. It gives you that sort of control over the AI. So very keen if people are interested in talking to us about that. And in evaluations, we evaluated it with older people living at home. We didn't get as many changes to the long-term activities as I expected, but we realized that what it did do was give the people, the older people, a much greater sense of agency about quality of life. People were talking to them about quality of life. They could experiment with different permutations in their quality of life planning so as to inform their decisions. So there's increased sense of agency with these kinds of simple tools. Last but not least, obviously this is not ours, back to ChatGPT. What's interesting is that you can use the knowledge of creative thinking techniques to create more creative prompts. You can either say, tell me how to overcome this problem, and the tool will be quite perfunctory, pragmatic even. But if you ask, how to solve this problem using the X and Y technique and say the steps you want to go through, like constraint removal, it suddenly becomes a lot more creative because you're giving it creative instructions rather than uncreative ones, because it's simply going to respond to what you ask it to do. So I would recommend you sort of use some of these creativity techniques so as to drive how you might use ChatGPT. Other things we've learned is that most people tend to ask for answers. Why don't you ask it to give you, what are the right questions I should be asking about this case? That leads you into far more interesting areas. We're just treating it as automation, but really it's your smart friend. Ask it for personas of the sort that I've talked about before. It's really quite good at that, actually. And yeah, even ask it for analogies. I've got this particular care challenge. What analogical examples are out there? And it'll come up with examples, and then you can apply the analogy technique, depending on how well they fit. So if you do use GPT in any kind of form here, it's probably wise to think about how you're using it, and don't rush to the idea that it's just there for solutions. I've got no idea. How much time have I taken over this? All right, we're almost there. Okay. So, what I'm here to do is really open up channels of communication if you want to keep talking. We have this Institute for Creativity and AI that was set up last October, and I'm the director. We're looking at how we can develop everything I've called here is we call it co-creative AI. So it's AI not to automate, but to co-create with you. So the tool's trying to be a bit creative in order for you to be creative. So you're working in a dovetailed manner with it. And we're working across the professions, and that can include social care professions. A lot of our work is understanding how AI is beginning to change how professional work is happening. At the moment, we're more focused on creative disciplines like design, which are really under threat, because the tools can now produce better visuals than the designers, which is really a breakthrough. But of course, I'm not aware of much happening in social care, so there's scope there for studies, investigations, even finding funding to work together. What might we do? We know a lot about creative thinking techniques, so if you need skills training or any of that kind of stuff, more than happy to come in and do that. Explore different frameworks, methods, and so on. Likewise, if you're looking for AI skills training related to how to use creative thinking techniques, we can do that. We've got loads more tools, by the way. I've been quite coy in what I've shown you. So we've got some other tools out here, and some of those other techniques I talked about are also in there, but not for social care. So a quick tweak would make them suitable for social care. And also just encouraging you to think creatively about how to be creative, if you see what I mean. Just get off those rails. We only live once. You know, creativity is associated with happiness, quality of life, and so on. So we have to make ourselves happy in order to make other people happy. I think that's it actually. There you go, I finished.